The luxurious lobby of one of Dublin's most expensive hotels was in complete chaos. A wealthy Arab gentleman, furious beyond measure, was shouting in his native tongue. And no one, not the manager, not the terrified staff, could contain him. Guests retreated in silence, eyes wide with shock, whilst tension filled the air like a storm about to break. Until suddenly, an unexpected voice rose up, and the world stopped. It was the voice of someone who should never have been there. Someone invisible to everyone's eyes. But in that instant, as she spoke her first words in fluent Arabic, she didn't just silence the most powerful man in the room. She also awakened in him a look of shock, as if he'd just encountered a ghost from his past. And what he said next made everyone freeze with astonishment, and would forever change that woman's destiny. But who was she really? If you enjoy stories that send shivers down your spine, move you to tears, and leave you utterly surprised, subscribe to the channel now and prepare yourself. This is one of the most intense tales you'll ever hear. The grand clock in the lobby of Dublin's Hotel Westbury struck 6 in the evening when the scene erupted. A wealthy Arab gentleman, wrapped in a gray wool overcoat, roared in fury at the stunned staff members. The receptionists trembled. The manager sweated in desperation, but no one could contain him. With each word spat in Arabic, guests retreated, embarrassed and frightened. And it was in that instant, amidst the chaos, that the invisible woman in the navy blue uniform appeared with her bucket and mop. Soraya Abebe, the Ethiopian cleaner, looked straight at the man and, with a clear voice, responded in fluent Arabic, "Please calm yourself. I understand what you're saying." The silence fell like thunder. The impromptu audience of guests and staff turned their faces towards her, bewildered. The manager, Kieran Redmond, flushed with rage. After all, just minutes before, he had humiliated her publicly, telling her not to mess up the scenery of a luxury hotel by walking through reception with her bucket. Now, the same woman he had treated like dust became the only one capable of controlling the hotel's most valuable guest. The millionaire, Farid al-Mansour, froze. His gaze pierced through Soraya like a blade. He breathed deeply, slowly lowered his voice, and in Arabic heavy with sorrow asked, "Where do you know the language of my childhood from?" The entire lobby held its breath. The manager tried to intervene, but Farid raised his hand, silencing him. "Only she speaks now," he decreed. Soraya, swallowing hard, felt that in that moment her life would never be the same. The whispers began immediately. Guests exchanging glances, staff members whispering behind hands. How could a simple cleaner, a woman they barely noticed as she went about her duties, suddenly become the center of such attention? How could she speak the language of wealth and power when she cleaned their floors? The hotel's marble floors reflected the crystal chandeliers above, casting dancing shadows across the faces of everyone watching. Soraya's worn shoes seemed to echo louder than usual against the polished stone. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning, still gripped the mop handle as if it were an anchor to the world she knew, a world where she was invisible, safe in her anonymity. But safety was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every eye in that opulent lobby was now fixed on her, and she could feel the weight of their scrutiny like a physical force. The rich mahogany panels of the walls seemed to close in around her, and the scent of expensive perfumes mixing with cleaning chemicals created an almost suffocating atmosphere. Farid stepped closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble. The sound seemed to reverberate through the sudden silence, each step deliberate and measured. His eyes, dark, intelligent, and now filled with something between recognition and accusation, never left her face. "Answer me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than his earlier shouting. "Where did you learn to speak my language?" Soraya felt her heart hammering against her ribs. 20 years of carefully constructed invisibility, 20 years of keeping her head down and her past buried, suddenly felt as fragile as glass. The other staff members were backing away now, sensing that something momentous was unfolding, something that would change the careful hierarchy of their small world forever. Kieran, his face now purple with indignation, opened his mouth to speak, but Farid's glare silenced him more effectively than any words could have. This was no longer about hotel management or customer service. This was something far more personal, far more dangerous. Farid stared at her for what felt like eternity, his gaze traveling over her features as if trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for years. The lobby's atmosphere grew thick with tension, guests shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay and witness this drama or flee to their rooms. Finally, Farid spoke again, his voice barely audible but carrying across the silent space like a whisper of thunder. "I know your face. But from where?" The next morning, Soraya was summoned to the administrative office. The manager, visibly uncomfortable, informed her that the guest had demanded her presence throughout his entire stay. Officially, she would be a temporary interpreter. But everyone knew that for a simple cleaner, this was an absurd rupture of hierarchy. Colleagues whispered in the corridors. Some said she had enchanted the millionaire. Others that there was some hidden scandal. Yesterday's humiliation now became a poisonous rumor spreading through muffled laughter and sideways glances. The break room buzzed with speculation as Soraya passed through. Mary O'Sullivan, the head housekeeping supervisor, pursed her lips in disapproval. "Above her station, that one," she muttered to anyone who'd listen. "Mark my words, no good will come of it." The other cleaners, women who had worked alongside Soraya for years without truly seeing her, now examined her every movement with new eyes, searching for signs of the woman who could command a millionaire's attention. Bridget Murphy, a fellow cleaner with kind eyes but a loose tongue, pulled Soraya aside near the service lift. "What aren't you telling us?" she whispered urgently. "That man looked at you like he'd seen a ghost. And the way you spoke that foreign language, it was like watching someone else entirely." When Soraya entered the lobby again, she found Farid seated with a glass of mint tea, the aromatic steam curling upwards in the morning light streaming through the hotel's tall windows. He didn't ask for permission, simply announced, "You'll accompany me to meetings. I trust you more than anyone here." The manager nearly fainted with indignation but dared not protest. Inside, Soraya trembled. She had never expected to speak Arabic again after years of burying painful memories from the time she lived in a refugee camp. Now, each word was a risk. What if some detail from her past came to light? The weight of the language felt foreign on her tongue, yet hauntingly familiar. Each Arabic phrase she might have to speak would be like opening doors she had sealed shut, rooms in her memory that contained too much pain to revisit. But she had no choice. Kieran had made that clear with his barely concealed threats about her job security. During their first meeting with Dublin property developers in the hotel's conference room, Soraya sat quietly in the corner, translating when needed. The Irish businessmen, Seamus Kelly and Dermot Walsh, kept glancing at her with barely concealed curiosity. How had a hotel cleaner become essential to a multi-million-euro deal? The absurdity wasn't lost on anyone in the room, least of all Soraya herself. Farid conducted business with the cold efficiency of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, but she noticed how his eyes would drift to her during pauses in conversation, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It was as if he were trying to place her face in a context that remained just beyond his grasp. At the end of the afternoon, Farid opened a briefcase before her. Among contracts and documents, there was a yellowed photograph. A child of about 4 years old smiled in front of a mosque in Amman. Behind the photo, written in English with shaky letters, was the name, Aidan O'Callaghan. Soraya paled. It was impossible that this photograph had fallen into his hands. The name hit her like a physical blow. Aidan O'Callaghan, the little boy with the bright eyes who had called her Mama Soraya in broken Arabic mixed with English. The child she had cradled through fever, sung to sleep, protected with every fiber of her being during those terrible months in the refugee camp. The boy she had lost when the adoption agencies came with their official papers and promises of better lives in distant countries. Her hands began to shake as she stared at the photograph. The mosque in the background was one she recognized, the small one near the camp where she had taken Aidan to learn prayers, where she had taught him the few words of Arabic she knew. But how had this photo, this precious memory she thought was lost forever, found its way to Farid? The conference room suddenly felt airless. The polished table reflected the afternoon light streaming through Dublin's gray sky, but all Soraya could see was that little face smiling up at her from 20 years ago. All she could hear was his laugh, high and pure, echoing through the camp's dusty corridors. Farid watched her reaction with the sharp attention of a predator. Every micro-expression, every tremor in her hands, every sharp intake of breath, he catalogued it all. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't chance. Whatever connection existed between this woman and his past ran deeper than a simple shared language. "You know this child," he said. Not a question but a statement heavy with accusation and desperate hope. "And you're going to tell me who he is." Farid fixed her with his gaze and said in a low tone, "You know who this child is, and I want you to tell me now." Soraya spent the night wide awake, reliving memories she had sworn never to touch again. Years ago, when she fled Ethiopia, she found refuge in Aman. It was there she met an abandoned child, left in the care of foreign volunteers. Soraya fed him, tended his fevers, rocked him to sleep. To everyone else, he was just another orphan with no future. But to her, he was like a son. The next morning, sitting opposite Farid in a Dublin conference room, her heart beat like a drum. The memories crashed over her in waves as she sat in the sterile conference room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power that felt so foreign to her world. She remembered the dusty corridors of the refugee camp, the smell of cooking fires and unwashed bodies, the sound of children crying in languages from across Africa and the Middle East. But most of all, she remembered Aidan's small hand in hers, trust absolute in his bright green eyes. Those eyes, how had she forgotten? They were Irish eyes even then. The volunteers had whispered about his origins, about the Irish aid worker who had died in a car accident, leaving behind a child with no family to claim him. But documentation was scarce. Records were lost. And in the chaos of the camp, one more orphaned child simply became part of the landscape of human suffering. Farid's assistant, Karim Haddad, slipped into the room during a break in the morning's property negotiations. A thin man with calculating eyes, he moved like a snake through water, smooth, silent, and somehow threatening. He approached Soraya and whispered in venomous tones, "Be careful. He's testing you. Don't trust what he says and don't show what you know." Soraya froze. Was it true that Farid suspected her? Or was this just the assistant's jealousy? The tension was unbearable. Karim's warning sent ice through her veins. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to build her quiet life in Dublin. After the refugee camp, after losing Aidan to the adoption system, she had found her way to Ireland through a church sponsorship program. Years of cleaning floors, learning English, saving every penny to bring her surviving family members to safety. All of it could disappear if she became entangled in whatever game these powerful men were playing. But as she watched Karim's retreating form, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Pinned to his jacket lapel was a small enamel pin, the logo of an Irish adoption agency she recognized, the same agency that had taken Aidan from the camp 20 years ago, promising him a better life with a loving family in the West. In the middle of the meeting, Farid abruptly interrupted the Irish executives and, staring directly at Soraya, declared, "This boy disappeared from Amman over 20 years ago. My son, and you were there." The world spun before her eyes. The businessman looked on in shock, not understanding. Soraya, choking, tried to respond, but the words were lost. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Seamus Kelly, the lead developer, stopped mid-sentence about planning permissions, his mouth hanging open. Dermot Walsh's pen froze over his contract notes. The formal atmosphere of international business dissolved into something far more primal. A father's anguish laid bare before strangers. "Your son?" Soraya's voice came out as barely a whisper. The photograph in her mind, little Aidan with his mischievous smile and copper-colored hair, suddenly took on new significance. She had always wondered about his parentage, about how a child with such distinctive features had ended up in a refugee camp in Jordan. But a son of Farid al-Mansour? It seemed impossible. Yet as she looked at Farid now, she could see it. The same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of holding his head when deep in thought. How had she missed it? How had no one in the camp seen the resemblance? "I cared for many children," she managed to say, her voice stronger now despite the tremor in her hands. The camp was chaos. Records were incomplete. Children arrived with no papers, no history. "Don't lie to me." Farid's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. "I can see it in your eyes. You remember him. You know exactly which child I'm talking about." The Irish businessmen exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was clearly far beyond their remit of property deals and investment portfolios. Seamus cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting." "No," Farid said firmly, never taking his eyes off Soraya. "This woman has information I've been searching for across 3 continents for 2 decades. We're not moving from this room until I have answers." Soraya felt the walls closing in around her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of her cleaning duties, to protect the small, safe life she had built. But Aidan's face in that photograph wouldn't let her. If this man was truly his father, if there was a chance, Farid stood up, approached her and said in a voice almost inaudible, "Either you return what's mine, or I ruin your life." The next day, the hotel atmosphere was saturated with gossip. Staff murmured about Soraya being the woman who deceived a sheikh, whilst the manager, thirsting for revenge, spread rumors that she had a criminal past. Soraya walked amongst distrustful glances and muffled laughter. Each step was a sentence of humiliation. Even so, she forced herself to keep her head high, though inside she was shattered. The staff canteen had become a battlefield of whispers. Myra Sullivan held court at the corner table, her voice carrying just enough for Soraya to catch fragments. Always knew there was something off about that one. Foreign papers probably fake. What decent woman hides such secrets? The words stung more than any physical blow, each syllable designed to strip away the dignity she had fought so hard to build. Bridget Murphy, who had once shared her tea breaks with Soraya, now avoided eye contact entirely. The betrayal cut deep. These women had worked alongside her for years, had shared stories of children's illnesses and worried about bills together. Now they looked at her as if she were a stranger, a threat to their small, secure world. Even worse were the guests' reactions. The well-dressed ladies from Cork who always requested fresh towels now pressed themselves against walls when she passed. The businessman from Galway who used to nod politely now stared with open suspicion. Soraya had become a spectacle, a curiosity, something to be observed and discussed rather than a human being deserving of basic respect. When summoned again to the millionaire's suite, Soraya found not just contracts on the table, but immigration records and old newspaper clippings as well. Someone had compiled a dossier about her life. Worse still, there were documents Soraya had never seen before, papers suggesting that the boy she had raised was not Farid's son, but a child intentionally switched. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. The documents were thorough, professional, the kind of investigation that required serious money and connections. Her visa applications from years ago, records from the refugee camp, even testimonies from aid workers she barely remembered. But it was the adoption papers that made her stomach drop. Official forms bearing seals and signatures she recognized, documenting the transfer of one Aidan O'Callaghan to an Irish family in County Cork. But the photograph attached to these papers showed a different child entirely. Not the boy she had loved and lost, but another child, darker-haired, with different features. Someone had deliberately falsified records, created a paper trail that led nowhere while the real Aidan disappeared into a system designed to protect children and hide them. My God, she whispered, staring at the forgeries. The sophistication of the deception was staggering. This wasn't the work of desperate parents or overwhelmed aid workers. This was systematic, organized, profitable. Farid stared at her with hatred and desperation mixed together. You knew. For all these years you lived with the lie. You raised a son who wasn't mine, stole my blood and left me in darkness. Soraya tried to protest, but the accusation weighed like molten iron. The manager, who had overheard part of the conversation from outside, ran to spread the cruelest version possible through the corridors. But Farid's accusations weren't entirely wrong, and that truth burned more than any lie. She had suspected something wasn't right when the adoption papers came through. The timing had been too convenient, the process too rushed. Children didn't simply disappear from refugee camps without leaving traces, without questions being asked. Yet she had been so grateful to know Aidan was going to a loving family, so exhausted by the grief of losing him that she hadn't pressed for answers. I was just trying to survive, she said, her voice breaking. In that camp we all were. You don't understand what it was like. The chaos, the fear, the way children would arrive with nothing, not even names sometimes. Don't you dare make excuses, Farid snarled. My son had a name. He had a father searching for him. He had a birthright, a heritage, a future I could have given him. And you, his voice cracked with emotion, you let them steal all of that. The worst part was seeing the pain beneath his anger. This wasn't just about money or power or wounded pride. This was a father's grief, raw and unhealed after 20 years. Soraya had held Aidan through his nightmares, sung him lullabies, been the mother he needed in those crucial early years. But Farid had spent those same years searching, hoping, never knowing if his son was alive or dead. The hotel corridors outside buzzed with Kieran's whispered version of events. He painted Soraya as a master manipulator, a woman who had seduced a wealthy man with stolen affection for a child that wasn't his. Each retelling made the story more salacious, more damaging to her reputation. By evening, even the kitchen staff, people who had barely noticed her existence before, were staring and whispering. She had become the hotel's scandal, It's entertainment. It's cautionary tale about people who tried to rise above their station. Soraya closed her eyes and whispered, Farid, I wasn't the one who stole your son, but I know who did. Soraya spent the following morning in a silence that ached. Every corner of the hotel seemed to echo with voices accusing her. When she finally faced Farid in his suite, she noticed he was no longer furious, but devastated. He handed her a newspaper clipping. Child disappears from refugee center in Amman. The date coincided exactly with the period when Soraya was caring for the boy. She felt her throat close. The past she had sworn to bury was now headline news before her eyes. The yellowed newspaper felt fragile between her fingers, the Arabic text bringing back memories of huddling around radios in the camp, listening for news from home countries they might never see again. But this headline was different. It spoke of a systematic search, of a father who had never stopped looking, of international agencies mobilized to find one small boy among thousands of displaced children. The accompanying photograph showed a younger Farid, his hair still dark, standing beside Jordanian officials and aid workers. His face was etched with the kind of desperation that transcends language barriers. Soraya recognized some of the aid workers in the background, people she had trusted, people who had promised to protect the children in their care. He was reported missing 3 days after you signed papers saying you would care for him temporarily, Farid said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 3 days, Soraya. In those 3 days, my son vanished from official records as if he had never existed. The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke. Soraya remembered those 3 days clearly now. The confusion when new papers arrived, the rushed explanations from camp administrators, the promises that everything was perfectly legal and in Aiden's best interests. She had been naive, trusting, desperate to believe that someone, somewhere, was genuinely looking out for the children's welfare. Karim, the assistant, appeared unexpectedly in the doorway and, in English, laced with venom, said, If she tells the truth, you lose more than a son. You lose the empire. The silence became suffocating. Soraya realized she wasn't just facing a desperate father, but a man surrounded by interests that made her a target. The words hit her like physical blows. Empire? What empire could possibly be connected to one lost child from a refugee camp? But as she looked at Karim's calculating expression, pieces began falling into place. The expensive investigation into her past, the detailed documentation, the way certain people seemed to know exactly where to look for information. This wasn't about family reunification. This was about power, money, and secrets worth killing to protect. What empire? She asked, her voice barely audible. Karim's smile was cold as winter rain. Ask yourself why a billionaire's son ended up in a refugee camp in the first place. Ask yourself who benefits when heirs disappear. Ask yourself who's been managing Mr. Al-Mansour's business interests while he's been distracted by his search. Farid's face went ashen. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked genuinely afraid. Karim, enough. No. I think she deserves to know what she's walked into, Karim continued, his voice gaining strength. Your touching reunion story might just destroy everything we've built. Some truths are too expensive to survive. Soraya felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just about a lost child anymore. It was about money, succession, corporate control. She was a threat to an entire financial empire simply by knowing what she knew. Soraya breathed deeply, faced Farid and revealed, This boy you're searching for. I raised him for 4 years, but he wasn't your son. I discovered too late that he had been switched, and someone very close to you knew about it. Farid stood motionless, as if he had been struck. The revelation hung between them like a death sentence. Farid's knees seemed to buckle, and he gripped the edge of his desk for support. 20 years of searching, of hoping, of believing that somewhere in the world his son was alive and waiting to be found. All of it crashing down in a single moment. Switched? His voice was barely human, more animal than man. What do you mean, switched? Soraya's own tears began to fall now. Years of suppressed guilt and grief finally breaking free. The boy I loved, the boy I called Aiden, he had green eyes and copper hair. He spoke English with an Irish accent he'd learned from the volunteers. But your son, the child in these official photographs, he was different. Darker. Arabic was his first language. You're lying. But even as Farid said it, she could see he was beginning to believe her. The pieces were fitting together in ways that made terrible sense. I'm not lying. I wish I were. The boy I raised, the boy I loved as my own. He was switched with your real son. Someone took your child and gave me another, probably to hide the trail, to make the search impossible. But who would do such a thing? Who would have that kind of access? That kind of power? Soraya wiped her eyes and looked directly at Kareem, who had gone very still in the doorway. Someone who knew both children would end up in the adoption system. Someone who could manipulate records. Someone who understood exactly how much money was at stake. Farid followed her gaze to his assistant, and for the first time in 20 years, began to see the man with clear eyes. Soraya then completed, with tears streaming down her face. It was someone from here. From Ireland. Farid ordered the conference room locked. No hotel employee dared question it. The air seemed heavier than Dublin's grey sky that rained outside. Soraya, before him, trembled, but her voice didn't waver. I saw falsified documents. The boy I took home was delivered by an adoption organization but manipulated. It was all to cover up business dealings between investors and politicians. The locked door felt like a barrier between them and a world that suddenly seemed full of enemies. Soraya could hear the muffled sounds of hotel life continuing outside. Guests checking in, staff going about their duties, the ordinary rhythm of Dublin commerce. But inside this room, they were uncovering a conspiracy that had destroyed lives and fortunes. Tell me exactly what you saw, Farid demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Soraya closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember details she had tried for years to forget. There were men who came to the camp regularly, not aid workers, businessmen. They spoke in hushed tones with the administrators, always just before children were selected for adoption. Money changed hands, though they called it processing fees and administrative costs. Describe them. One was Irish. Tall, red hair going gray. Expensive clothes, but trying to look humble. He had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes. The children were afraid of him, though he never raised his voice. He would review files, point to certain names, and those children would disappear within days. Farid's face had gone white. What was his name? I only heard it once. The administrator called him Mr. Redmond. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Kareem, still standing in the doorway, seemed to have stopped breathing. Farid looked out the window and murmured, "If this is true, it means they didn't just steal my son. They stole my entire life." Kareem tried to interrupt, but Farid turned against him with fury. "Did you know about this?" The tension grew like gunpowder about to explode. Kareem's composure finally cracked. For 20 years, he had been the perfect assistant, efficient, loyal, discreet. But now, faced with his employer's rage and the collapse of carefully constructed lies, his mask slipped. "What was I supposed to do?" he shouted back. "You were falling apart, spending millions on searches that led nowhere, neglecting business opportunities, refusing to remarry and produce another heir. The board was talking about removing you as CEO. Your own family was plotting to have you declared incompetent, so you helped them cover it up. I helped save your empire. Do you think your business partners cared about one lost child when there were billions at stake? Your grief was becoming expensive, Farid. Someone had to make the practical decisions." Soraya watched this exchange with growing horror. These men were talking about Aiden, sweet, laughing Aiden who had called her mama and trusted her with his whole heart, as if he were a business liability, a problem to be managed rather than a child to be protected. "Where is my real son?" Farid's voice was barely controlled. "I don't know," Kareem admitted. That was the point. He had to disappear completely. New identity, new family, new country. Somewhere you'd never find him. And the boy Soraya raised? A decoy. Close enough in age to confuse the records, but from a completely different background. If you ever got close to finding him, the DNA wouldn't match, and you'd assume you'd been chasing the wrong lead. Then Soraya pulled from her bag a crumpled paper she had kept since the refugee camp. It was an old letter, signed by an Irish intermediary. Farid immediately recognized the signature. It was from Kieran Redmond, the current hotel manager. The letter was written on official letterhead, the kind of document that looked legitimate enough to satisfy bureaucrats, but vague enough to hide its true purpose. But it was the signature that made Farid's blood run cold. The same flourish, the same confident stroke he had seen on dozens of business contracts over the years. "He's been here all along," Soraya whispered. "Working in this hotel, watching you, probably reporting back to whoever paid him to destroy your family." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. The choice of this specific hotel for his Dublin business trip hadn't been random. Kareem had suggested it. had made the reservations, had ensured Fareed would come face to face with one of the architects of his son's disappearance. 20 years, Fareed said, his voice hollow. 20 years I've been staying in hotels managed by the man who stole my child. It gets worse, Soraya said quietly. Look at the date on that letter. It's from 3 months after your son disappeared. He was already planning the cover-up before anyone knew there would be an investigation. Fareed's hand shook as he held the letter. The realization that he had been systematically betrayed by people he trusted, that his grief had been manipulated and monetized, that his son's disappearance had been orchestrated by his own associates. It was too much for any father to bear. Kieran has been getting progress reports about your search efforts for 2 decades, Kareem said, his voice now resigned to confession. Every dead end, every false lead, every moment you came close to the truth. He knew about it before you did. Soraya felt sick. The manager who had humiliated her, who had spread vicious rumors about her character, who had treated her like dirt beneath his feet, he was one of the people responsible for the most heinous crime she could imagine. Fareed slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "He stole my son." That night, Soraya was discreetly summoned to Fareed's suite. He seemed older, bent by the weight of revelation. He extended a blank check to her and said, "You can save your children's lives. Just keep quiet. Say nothing to the police. Don't expose my name. I'll take care of you and your family." The temptation burned like poison. The chance to finally give dignity to her loved ones, after years of invisibility. The check lay between them on the mahogany coffee table like a snake coiled to strike. Soraya stared at it, her mind racing through calculations she had made 1,000 times before. Her daughter Zara's university fees in Cork, money she could never afford on a cleaner's wages. Her elderly mother's medical bills back in Ethiopia, treatments that could add years to her life. Her youngest son's dreams of studying engineering, dreams that died a little more each month as reality ground them down. "How much?" she whispered, hating herself for asking. "Enough to change everything. Enough to move your family to a better neighborhood, to send your children to the best schools, to ensure your mother gets the care she needs. Enough to make you disappear from this hotel and never look back." The suite's luxury surrounded her like a golden cage. Persian carpets beneath her feet, crystal glasses catching the light from Dublin's street lamps outside, artwork on the walls worth more than she would earn in a lifetime. This was the world Fareed inhabited, a world where problems could be solved with money, where silence could be purchased like any other commodity. But Soraya knew the price. She would have to live with the knowledge that somewhere, Fareed's real son was growing up without knowing his father's name. That Aiden, the boy she had loved, was living a lie built on his switched identity. That Kieran Redmond would continue profiting from his crimes, probably finding new victims, new children to exploit. "What about justice, Hon?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Justice?" Fareed laughed bitterly. "I've been searching for justice for 20 years. It's expensive, exhausting, and it changes nothing. My son is still lost. Your boy is still confused about his identity. The people responsible are still powerful. Money, at least, is real. It feeds children and pays for medicine and builds futures." Soraya knew she was being tested, but she also understood that Fareed was genuinely trying to protect her. Exposing this conspiracy would make her a target. People who had orchestrated the disappearance of a billionaire's son wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a refugee woman who knew too much. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like lead. Every decision seemed wrong. If she took the money and stayed silent, she became complicit in the cover-up. If she refused and went to the authorities, she risked not only her own life but the future of her children who depended on her. But she knew the price. If she accepted, she would perpetuate the lie. If she refused, she risked the fury of a powerful man. The dilemma tore her apart. With each passing second, she remembered the boy she had cradled in her arms, the faith she had placed in a just world. The memory of Aiden's laughter echoed in her mind, his small voice asking her why some children had families and others didn't. Her promise to him that someday, everything would make sense, that there was a reason for everything, that good people would always try to do the right thing. How could she explain to that memory, to that pure trust, that sometimes good people chose silence over justice because the world was too dangerous for truth? "There's something else," Fareed said quietly. "If you go to the authorities, they'll investigate you too. Your refugee status, your work permits, your family's documentation. Everything will be scrutinized. Immigration officials will want to know how a simple cleaner became involved in international fraud. Your children could lose their right to remain in Ireland. The threat was subtle but clear. Even if Farid didn't actively work against her, the exposure would bring unwanted attention from government agencies that had the power to destroy her family's carefully built life in Ireland. Soraya thought of Zara, studying hard at University College Cork, finally feeling like she belonged somewhere, of her son Dawit, captain of his secondary school's football team, proud to represent his Dublin school in competitions, of her youngest, Hanan, who spoke English with a perfect Dublin accent and considered herself fully Irish. All of it could disappear overnight if the wrong questions were asked by the wrong people. "I need time," she said finally. "You have until morning," Farid replied. "After that, I make decisions about how to handle this situation without your input." With tears burning her eyes, she answered simply, "Dignity has no price." Farid breathed deeply, almost relieved, almost furious. The silence between them was sharper than any word. The check remained on the table between them, unsigned but heavy with possibility. Soraya stood slowly, her cleaning uniform suddenly feeling like armor rather than a mark of servitude. She had made her choice, and she could see in Farid's eyes that he had expected it, perhaps even hoped for it. "You're either very brave or very foolish," he said. "Perhaps both," she replied, "but I'll sleep tonight knowing I didn't sell the truth." As she opened the door to leave, she found the manager Kieran standing in the corridor, holding a manila folder. "You still don't know everything," he said, his voice trembling with some emotion she couldn't identify. The folder in his hand seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. After everything she had learned, everything she had endured, there was still more. Still deeper levels of deception and betrayal waiting to be uncovered. "What's in there?" she asked. Though part of her didn't want to know, Kieran's hand shook as he held the folder. "The real reason your boy ended up in that camp. The real reason any of this happened. You think this was about money? About business deals? About inheritance?" He opened the folder slightly, revealing official documents with government seals, photographs of men in expensive suits shaking hands with officials, bank transfer records with amounts that made her head spin. This was about covering up something much worse. Kieran handed the folder to Soraya, unable to meet her eyes. Inside were financial records from 2 decades ago. The child's disappearance hadn't been merely an error or accident. It had been a profitable arrangement, where he, Kieran, had signed false documents to please local politicians and gain favors from Farid himself. "Your son disappeared because we all had something to profit from," he confessed, his voice trembling. The ground seemed to vanish beneath Soraya's feet. The documents painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of Irish government and international aid organizations. Bank transfers disguised as charitable donations, contracts for refugee camp construction that lined the pockets of politicians, adoption fees that were laundered through legitimate-looking charities. But it was the photographs that made Soraya's blood freeze. Images of Kieran, 20 years younger, shaking hands with government ministers at charity galas. Pictures of him presenting oversized checks to refugee organizations while cameras flashed. The same smile he wore now when greeting hotel guests, but younger, hungrier, less worn by guilt. "I was nobody then," Kieran said, his voice breaking. "Assistant to a junior minister, barely making ends meet. When the opportunity came to facilitate certain arrangements, the money seemed like a gift from God." "Arrangements?" Soraya's voice was deadly quiet. Wealthy families wanted children. Specific types of children. Light-skinned, likely to integrate well into Western society, with no family to ask questions later. At the same time, children like Farid's son, high-profile disappearances that would generate investigations, needed to vanish completely. The horrible logic of it became clear. The refugee camps hadn't just been places of refuge. They had been hunting grounds for predators who saw desperate children as commodities to be traded. "So you switched them," Soraya said, "gave the marketable children to paying families and made the inconvenient ones disappear." "It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone," Kieran protested weakly. "The children got homes. The families got what they wanted. Everyone was happy, except for the parents searching for their lost children, except for the children growing up with false identities, except for people like me who loved them and lost them to your greed." Farid collapsed into his chair, strengthless. For years he had believed the world had stolen his son from him. Now he discovered that deep down, he had been an unwitting accomplice to a lie much larger than himself. Soraya didn't cry. She simply closed the folder, stood up and said, "Blood can be stolen, but the love I gave that child, no one can take away. The revelation completed the circle of their tragedy. Farid hadn't just lost his son to random misfortune or bureaucratic incompetence. He had lost him to a system that his own wealth and status had inadvertently helped create. The charitable donations he had made to refugee organizations, the political connections he had cultivated, the business relationships that had made him powerful, all of it had contributed to the machine that had consumed his child. "I funded my own son's disappearance," he whispered, the words falling like stones into water. Soraya understood now why he had seemed so familiar when she first saw him in the hotel lobby, not because she had met him before, but because she had seen his photograph in the camp administrator's office, one of the generous donors whose contributions made their work possible. The cruelest irony was that Farid's money, intended to help refugee children, had instead created a market for them. His genuine desire to make a difference had been twisted into a tool for exploitation by people like Kieran, who saw opportunity in others' pain. "What happened to your real son?" Soraya asked gently. "Sold to a family in Australia," Kieran admitted. "New name, new papers, new history. He probably doesn't even know he's adopted. His new parents think they saved him from poverty. They have no idea they bought him from traffickers. And Aidan, the boy I raised, probably living somewhere in rural Ireland wondering why he has memories of speaking Arabic, why he sometimes dreams of desert landscapes he's never seen. The family that adopted him thinks he's just imaginative." The next morning, before the eyes of the hotel staff, Soraya delivered the documents to Irish authorities. Farid didn't stop her. He simply bowed his head in respect, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. She walked out through the main entrance with firm steps, carrying only her worn bag. Outside, the fine rain washed the stones of Grafton Street. The world hadn't returned anything to her, but it had given her something that no one could corrupt: the courage to never sell her dignity. The hotel lobby buzzed with shocked whispers as uniformed guards led Kieran away in handcuffs. Guests lowered their newspapers to stare. Staff members huddled in corners, exchanging fragments of information they couldn't quite piece together. The carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbled in a matter of hours. Mayor O'Sullivan stood frozen by the reception desk, finally understanding that the woman she had dismissed as just another immigrant cleaner had been the key to unraveling an international conspiracy. Bridget Murphy wept openly, ashamed of her earlier suspicions and gossip. Farid remained in his suite for 3 days, making phone calls to investigators across 3 continents, funding new searches for both his biological son and the boy Soraya had loved. He could never undo the damage, but he could ensure that both children, now grown men, had the chance to learn the truth about their origins if they chose to. Before leaving Dublin, he established a foundation in Soraya's name, dedicated to protecting refugee children from exploitation. It was a small gesture toward redemption, but genuine in its intent. As for Soraya, she returned to cleaning floors, but now she walked with a different posture. Her colleagues treated her with newfound respect, not because she had briefly attracted a billionaire's attention, but because she had chosen truth over comfort, justice over security. Some evenings, she would stand on O'Connell Bridge and watch the River Liffey flow toward the sea, carrying with it the detritus of the city, but also its hopes and dreams. She thought often of Aidan, both the boy she had raised and the man he had become somewhere in the Irish countryside. She had lost him twice now, once to adoption, once to the truth, but the love remained unmarked by the corruption that had surrounded it. In a world that sought to commodify everything, including love itself, she had proven that some things remained beyond price, and that perhaps was victory enough.